Good afternoon and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Sushma Raman, the Executive Director, and today in our Towards Life 3.0 Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century talk series, we're delighted and honored to welcome Professor Jamal Greene, who's the Dwight Professor of Law at Columbia University and a board member of the Oversight Board. Professor Greene is going to speak to us about free speech on public platforms. He's a constitutional law expert whose scholarship focuses on the structure of legal and constitutional argument. He teaches constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, the law of the political process, First Amendment, and federal courts. He's the author of the book, How Rights Went Wrong, Why Our Obsession with Rights is Tearing America Apart. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Greene.
Thank you, Sushma, and thank you to the Carr Center. Should I just jump in? All right, so let's do that. And also thank you to all who are joining this webinar. I want to take this opportunity to try to marry a couple of different perspectives that I've developed on rights and on social media. Earlier this year, I published a book about rights called How Rights Went Wrong. And the basic argument of the book is that lawyers and citizens in the United States tend to approach rights conflicts in ways that essentialize rights and that understand rights in presumptively absolute terms, and that in part for those reasons, they tend to judicialize rights. Part of the argument of the book is that these tendencies, the tendency to think about rights as essentialized, as almost absolute, as judicialized, that they have a few negative consequences. For one thing, they tend to distort our understandings of justice. They tend to deny to our political discourse the resources that are needed to sort out conflicts between rights. It's hard for us to imagine rights coexisting within the same space and both being realized when they conflict with each other. And the book also argues that this way of understanding rights tends to exacerbate political polarization as people seek the favor of the Constitution and seek to deny the Constitution's favor to their political opponents. These are a set of issues that I continue to find interesting and indeed very current. But I also happen to wear a different non-academic hat as co-chair of the Oversight Board, which is a body that independently reviews content moderation decisions that are made by Facebook, now Meta. And the board does its job by issuing binding decisions on individual pieces of content and also issuing policy recommendations that extend beyond individual cases. As all of you know, Facebook has been in the news recently. If you've followed it at all, you know that part of the reason Facebook has been in the news is because it is once again faced with the accusation that its use of automation, in particular to promote content and to generate user engagement, has destructive social consequences. And there are a number of other reasons why Facebook is in the news, but that's really at the core of it. Those processes, those automated processes, don't overlap perfectly with the jurisdiction and remit of the Oversight Board, but they are certainly of interest to our work and I think to the work of the Carr Center as well. And as I said, I'd like to make some observations that kind of marry some of my thinking about rights with some comments on the work of the board. And I'm going to do that from an unusual perspective, and namely a perspective that is, for my purposes, a hypothetical perspective. I want to draw a subtle distinction that I think turns out to be an important distinction in how we frame the regulation of content that appears on social media platforms. It is common in the thought circles in which I now find myself to think about how the law would treat platforms, social media platforms, if they were state actors, right? So in the United States, there are frequent claims that social media sites restrict content in ways that would be illegal for the government to restrict content, illegal because in violation of the First Amendment. At times, there have also been analogous claims from international human rights lawyers about the ways in which certain kinds of content restrictions on social media sites are or may be inconsistent with protections given to free expression under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example. I want to resist those conclusions, or at least to resist the most simple-minded versions of those conclusions. And to motivate my thinking about this, I want to reframe the question from asking what regulations would be permitted if social media companies were governments, and ask instead what regulation would be permissible if governments ran competitive social media platforms. The distinction is subtle, and in fact, the questions are formally the same question, but I think the frame matters. And the reason I think the frame matters is because a shift in frame forces us to think not just of the rights of users, and then to compare them to the rights that are at stake when governments paradigmatically act against individuals, but instead to start the inquiry by thinking of the purposes and the distinctive structure of social media platforms. A shift in frame from thinking first and primarily about the rights of users to thinking about the structure and purposes of social media platforms forces us to think not just about what are the circumstances under which individual rights can trump government action, but also to keep in mind what the state is trying to accomplish when it regulates speech in a particular setting. A shift in frame, I think, leads us to think about rights conflicts, not just in terms of what pathologies are committed, but also in terms of what effective governance actually requires. A government that were hypothetically setting up a competitive social media platform would be engaged in an activity that is not paradigmatic of the government activity that motivates the First Amendment or that motivates the international human rights regime. And so one of the questions I want to put to you all and to talk about together is how much that fact might matter. Now, this question is not just a thought experiment, right? So Facebook and other social media companies have committed themselves to being guided by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The Oversight Board is charged with reconciling that commitment with Facebook's content practices. It's conceivable that other platforms may at some point pursue analogous projects in self-governance of their content regimes. Twitter has repeatedly been in the middle of lawsuits over the behavior of politicians on the platform and how those politicians are permitted to interact with other Twitter users. There have been proposals by academics, I'm thinking in particular of Ethan Zuckerman at MIT, to build what he's called a digital public infrastructure. Even if those kinds of proposals don't involve government largesse necessarily, they will require the building out of principles of public law to govern social media spaces. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to linger as long as I could in the weeds of sort of how to answer this question under domestic constitutional law in the United States. The question being, what kinds of legal norms would we apply to a government running a competitive social media platform? But I will make a few general observations. So because First Amendment law is both very demanding and also very old, there is a mature network of frameworks for thinking about free expression regulation in the context of institutions that are providing forums for speech, government institutions that are providing forums for speech, rather than regulating and punishing the primary conduct of individuals. And I'll mention two of those frameworks to illustrate a lingering problem in how US lawyers tend to think about these issues. The first framework is known as public forum doctrine. Public forum doctrine arises out of a recognition that there are forms of government property that are opened up for free expression, often selectively, and that distinctive rules are required under those circumstances. So for example, if the government runs a town hall meeting, or if the government allows certain forms of expression on a military base, what forms of discrimination between speakers or between the content of speech might be permissible under those circumstances. And generally speaking, the formal answer that courts have come to is that so-called viewpoint discrimination between the viewpoints of different speakers, is never permitted under these circumstances. And content discrimination between different subject matter of speech, is permitted only if the particular forum has ex ante been limited to particular topics, right? So you can say this debate stage is only going to be about discussion of certain topics, but you can't do it extemporaneously on the fly. One of the key cases in this line of decisions involved a public auditorium in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The auditorium was public, but it could be leased out for private events. And a theater group wanted to put on a production of the musical Hair, which has nudity, which has some sexual themes, and the city denied their application. So this gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, this kind of content discrimination is not permitted unless it can be shown that the content wasn't just racy or subversive, but was in fact obscene, right? So obscene that it's not even covered by the First Amendment. The standard for obscenity is very high. So this is a very demanding standard, right? For public social media regulation, if we're going to try to use that public forum standard to apply in the social media context, it's very demanding to say that you can't engage in any viewpoint discrimination, and that the kind of content discrimination that one can engage in is very limited. But there's a second framework that we might think is also relevant or alternatively relevant. In 2015, the US Supreme Court decided a case involving a Texas Department of Motor Vehicles program in which car owners could suggest logos and phrases to put on their license plates. So the standard Texas license plate could have a little phrase or a logo or something. So a wide range of applications were accepted and approved. Rather be golfing, we love Jeff Gordon, the NASCAR driver, a logo for the Oklahoma Sooners, which is the University of Oklahoma's football team and basketball team. Big rivals of Texas, by the way, but you could put this onto your Texas license plate. But then, of course, in the nature of the kinds of cases that get to the Supreme Court, the sons of Confederate veterans, right, apply for their own license plates. And those include a depiction of the flag of the Confederate States of America, right? So the stars and bars. Texas Motor Vehicle Department rejects the application. Sons of Confederate veterans then files a claim and claim a violation of the First Amendment. Now, if Texas had made its license plates into a public forum, right? If that's the way to analyze this case, if it's just like the Chattanooga movie theater, then Texas would lose the case because Texas was plainly engaged in discrimination on the basis of viewpoint. But Texas won the case. And the way they won the case is that instead of saying that this was a public forum, the Supreme Court instead says that Texas was engaged in so-called government speech. Now, government speech is permitted to engage in viewpoint discrimination. The idea is that because the government itself needs to have the freedom to express its own viewpoint, the Supreme Court has actually never identified any constitutional limitations on governmental speech. So this means, in theory, that Texas could screen its license plate logos however it wanted. Now, taken together, this line of cases suggests that, right, if a government forum is a so-called public forum, then there are very severe limits on how the government is allowed to restrict speech. But if a government forum is called government speech, then there are almost no limits on how the government may restrict speech. So what this means is that even though the question of whether a particular forum is a public forum or is instead an instance of government speech is a very subtle inquiry, it actually turns on very minute details. The consequence of calling it one or the other of those things is massive and is in fact discontinuous. And indeed, in the Texas case, the consequences of choosing the public forum category instead of the government speech category would have been so drastic. So they would have had to allow, swastikas on their license plates. So the consequences are so drastic that one fears that fear of that consequence is what led the court to this very curious conclusion that Texas itself was speaking through its citizens' choice of what to put on Texas license plates. So I'm going to return in a moment to what this might mean, what this dichotomy between sort of public forum doctrine and government speech might mean for the status of a hypothetical government-run social media platform. But in the meantime, what does international human rights law have to say about this kind of platform? The answer, so far as I can tell, is very little, at least very little with any clarity. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and various authoritative statements made about it is where one would most naturally look for guidance on government speech restrictions. Article 19 of the ICCPR allows for certain speech restrictions when, among other things, necessity and proportionality, this is a legal terms of art, are satisfied. In theory, application of what's known as proportionality analysis, which requires a kind of means ends fit between the regulation and the goal of the regulation. Proportionality analysis enables the international human rights regime to avoid the kind of perplexing discontinuity that I just described in US First Amendment law between public forum doctrine and government speech doctrine. You can be more contextually sensitive under proportionality analysis, but there are at least two important differences between platform governance and the kinds of conflicts that have historically generated human rights responses. So first is the fact that in content moderation, we are most often talking about whether a particular piece of content may be removed. And that's the penalty, that's the only penalty. That's really different from detaining someone, or really different from other kinds of coercive remedies or liability. Proportionality analysis should presumably account for that kind of difference, but there isn't much that the international human rights system has said so far about the application of proportionality in the context of moderation of content on a platform. The second significant difference is scale, and the scale of content governance on the internet, which is, I think, not well understood by members of the public. How much content we're really talking about here, 1 billion pieces of content just on Facebook alone in the average day. And that kind of scale enables ordinary speech harms to spread in ways that have not historically been even possible. Again, this should be relevant to proportionality analysis, but the relative immaturity of international human rights jurisprudence as applied to government-provided platforms for speech means that there's not much existing guidance on how to think about proportionality in this kind of novel context. Now, when we move from my hypothetical public platform back to the real world of content governance on private platforms, we have another problem, which is the problem of translating a government regulation context to a private regulation context. And when we're talking about speech norms, that's actually a really difficult and important problem of translation, because private platforms have, or I would argue they should be understood to have, to some degree, their own set of expressive interests, right? So Parler or Reddit's interest in allowing more expression than Facebook does is not just a pure financial interest, right? It's also an expressive interest, and any regulatory regime has to account for the fact that there are different kinds of expressive values being expressed by the platform governor themselves. Some version of that interest shows up in public forum and government speech doctrine. The law recognizes that the platform operator, has the right to express itself in some way through the content limits that it places on the platform. But in the US, we have these kinds of categorical instincts about US constitutional law. And so it means that the decision maker has to choose either the expressive interest of the users, this is public forum doctrine, or the expressive interest of the hosts, this is government speech doctrine. So rather than integrating those into a single regime, we have these dichotomous and discontinuous multiple regimes. Now, in my view, these cross-cutting norms, right, the norms of the rights of the user versus the rights of the platform to structure its platform in the way that it sees fits, those are cross-cutting norms that, in my view, make it basically unintelligible to measure platform rules based solely on the quantity of speech that they allow. That's an overly simplistic analysis of platform rules. I think it's better to measure those rules by their consistency, by their transparency, by the degree to which they're susceptible to abusive or arbitrary application, rather than thinking, oh, the fact that we see a lot of speech or a little bit of speech being regulated tells us something important about the normative considerations. I think it can't tell us very much at all. I want to make just a broader point, and then I'll just wrap up. I've tried to show in this brief talk that the question of applying legal norms to content moderation on social media platforms cannot coherently be reduced to a simple act of translation from government regulation of primary conduct. The police go out and arrest someone on the Greene, and just translating that to private regulation of social media platforms at social media scale. Just the act of translation is just not a simple one at all. But there's a broader point to be made about flattening conflicts over rights into applications of the most paradigmatic or pathological possible violations of those rights. In the speech context, right, if we see all speech restrictions as basically analogous, even in mitigated form, to criminal sedition prosecutions or purges of one's political enemies, that anytime you're regulating speech, there's some danger of a slippery slope sliding to, sedition prosecutions. If that's how we think about speech restrictions, we will misunderstand or mistrust the governance aims associated with most speech restrictions. I think we instead need to understand rights conflicts as just the ordinary byproduct of committing ourselves to a genuinely pluralistic and a social and political life. And so what that means is that conflicts over rights should not be thought of as an opportunity for kind of scolding the government or for rending our tunics, right? But they're really just invitations to creative forms of collective governance. And with that, I will pause for questions.
Fascinating and really thought-provoking. So many questions sort of bubbling up, and we welcome questions from our audience as well. So as I'm listening to you talk, and I'm thinking about the global context, because platforms like Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, are used around the world, including in countries where the governments are authoritarian. So I'm wondering about how your thinking plays out in this global context where platforms are really expanding their reach, but the forms of governance, the forms of regulations are different than in the United States.
I was muted, but I'm unmuted now. I think this is a very challenging problem of not just the variety of legal norms that and conventions that apply in different contexts, but just the fact that just the nature of the problem is different, and in some contexts can be radically different in ways that are not always fully recognized, right? So there's a certain debate over content governance in the United States, where there's a kind of a left and a right to the issue, and the left, the orthodox left liberal position is that platforms like Facebook allow too much misinformation and hate speech to spread that damages various institutions, including political institutions, damages the self-esteem of people, hurts with public health and all sorts of problems. And there's of course quite a lot to be said for that. There's a different narrative that is dominant on the U.S. right, which is that Facebook and other social media companies engage in censorship of people who have politically unpopular views. These critiques, which come from very, very different directions, can be true at the same time, right? So it can be true that that there is a political lean to the kinds of content that gets removed from Facebook, and it can also be true that not enough content is removed. And so that leads to all kinds of, and so there's a certain shape to the debate in the US. Well, you go to a different context, right? You go to India, or you go to Turkey, or you go to Hungary, or you go to Brazil, or you go to Ethiopia, right? And the kinds of, there is also a range of different kinds of problems associated with social media, but the idea of actually the biggest problem is there is an authoritarian government that manipulates the platform to punish their political enemies, right? It's a very different kind of problem than either the orthodox left problem in the US or the orthodox right problem in the US, and calls for very different kinds of solutions, right? So I don't know that there is a way of saying, okay, there's sort of a single problem with social media, right? It's algorithmic amplification, right? That's the single problem, right? And once we solve that problem, we've solved the issue. There is a range of problems that are, anytime you have a means of communication that is susceptible to manipulation by people who are opportunistic, and I use manipulation here in a neutral sense, right? So susceptible to being used by people who are opportunistic, whether for capitalistic financial reasons, or for reasons, or for political reasons, or for power-related reasons. There are going to be a range of problems associated with the existence of that platform and different strategies for trying to mitigate those problems. So I think there's no way to avoid being somewhat contextually sensitive. I do think that there are ways in which historically Facebook at least has resisted being contextually sensitive. They want to be a single platform for everyone. It's very hard to you can't just have rules for one country, given the nature of the internet for the most part. But I think there needs to. I tend to think that we have to step back a little bit from the idea that we can sort of resolve every problem and sort of eliminate every problem, and think that, well, the best we can do is mitigate problems, and you mitigate problems by creating institutions that can be trusted to take into consideration all of the relevant stakes. And I think that's the challenge. Facebook is not trusted for a variety of reasons. Governments are not trusted for a variety of reasons. The Oversight Board is not trusted by some for a variety of reasons, trusted by others. I think that part of what the board is trying to do is, or part of the impetus behind creating this institution is, how can we create sort of intermediate civil society institutions that are deserving of our trust? And that's what we're trying to do. And I think it's a design challenge that I think we've done a lot of good work in that direction, but there's more to be done.
Yeah, you raised a really good point about trust. And I think we're seeing trust on the decline around the world in all kinds of institutions. And social media has definitely played a part in that. But we've also benefited from the gains of technology to be able to communicate and build connections on a global scale and to build social change movements. And so that therein lie the dilemmas and the paradoxes of this work. So you mentioned earlier about the sort of expressive interests of users and platforms. And I'm wondering about the kind of expressive and business interests of specific platforms and how they're constructed very, very differently. Like you touched on the difference between Parler and Facebook, and that's just one instance. And so I'm wondering about your views on how much of this conversation really needs to be on a platform by platform basis, and how much of it is really sort of an industry or sector-wide conversation around norms, laws, policies, regulations.
Gosh, so I will say that I've not been able to develop strong views about how to engage in sector-wide regulation here. I mean, I think it's just such a complicated problem. The board itself doesn't have any particular position on state regulation at this level, but what I will say is that I generally think that it is promising, or most promising. So there are a few pieces of kind of low hanging fruit, or lower hanging fruit, right? So one is some degree of transparency, right? And I think that that's one thing that the board has so far done a good job of, that I think we could do much more of, which is platforms should communicate with users about exactly, at a minimum, exactly what they're doing, right? So when they engage in content moderation, what are the rules? Why was this taken down? What can you do to push back against that if you wish to? There's another layer of transparency, which is, exactly, that I think is much more complicated, which is exactly what are we doing with your information and your data? I have less to say about that insofar as it's less connected to the remit of the board, right? But I do think, as we think about the role that social media companies play within governance and within democracies, certainly, it's certainly important to think about if a platform has a lot of power and is influencing democratic discourse, sort of having some intermediary, right, or some other institution besides the platform itself that has some oversight over what is happening with people's information, how they're being fed information, those kinds of questions. I think it's, not speaking for the board necessarily, but speaking as a democratic citizen, I think is an important intervention. And the other thing I'd say is, sometimes if we are uncomfortable with direct regulation by the government, we do permit regulation. We do tell the government to, or have the government set standards at a certain level of generality, and then say, you're the one who has to implement this. Show us that you're doing it, and doing it in good faith, right? So responsible platform governance, requires some significant limits on harmful content going viral. If the government said something at that level and said, you platforms, you need to figure out how to do this, that would be, there'd be First Amendment objections to that. I'm sure it would be litigated, right? And in places where the First Amendment, where free expression norms are not as strong, that's already being experimented with, right? But I think I think even in the United States, that has an easier path than direct regulation of the content, the moderation practices of right? If there were just a norm stated at a higher level of generality, and platforms just had to show a kind of due diligence, I think that's promising.
So can you talk a little bit more about your role on the oversight board? You mentioned that the board doesn't take up certain kinds of cases, for example, around algorithmic amplification, but it's more individual cases. So can you just talk a bit about the role of the board, some of the cases you've worked on, and how do you address some of the criticisms? For example, there was another group that set up called the Real Facebook Oversight Board. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the board itself.
Sure. So I'll say a little bit about how the board is structured. I'm happy to say something about the Real Facebook Oversight Board as well. I'll just what you mentioned, the board not having say over algorithmic amplification. That's not something that's sort of explicitly within the remit of the board. That's not to say that the board could not make a policy recommendation that relates to some of those issues, but the individual cases the board makes binding decisions it's a final appellate body, right? So if you have content removed from Facebook or Instagram, or if you believe that Facebook has made a mistake in not removing content that's on the platform, there's an appeal to the oversight board, and the board is not subordinate to Facebook, right? So it's an independent institution. It's set up as a nonprofit that Facebook does not control. And Facebook can't overrule the decisions the board makes, and has no control over, can't fire members, for example. So it's an independent institution that tries to we issue written opinions about cases, and try to be transparent about how to weigh the relevant norms involved in engaging in content moderation. And Facebook's obligated to follow the board's decision. And then the board also is able to make recommendations about policy, structuring the community standards, bringing them in line with international human rights norms, which is something the board refers to quite a lot in Facebook having to live up to its human rights commitments. As to the real oversight board, so that's a group of Facebook critics who believe that the oversight board has too limited of a remit, and that there are deeper problems with Facebook than the individual problems of content moderation that the board engages with. And so they've called themselves the real oversight board and as I understand it, issue reports on various ways in which platforms should be regulated or should be reformed. I have no that seems fine by me. Facebook has and social media in general have lots of problems. I think the more people trying to shed light on those problems and try to offer constructive solutions to them, the better. The oversight board does have a limited remit that I think will grow over time, but the board is also makes issues binding decisions, right? And we're also a very diverse group that runs the ideological spectrum, and so as such, I'm learning as I participate in the building of this institution that it takes time to build an institution that functions effectively, that behaves responsibly, that issues opinions and recommendations, that gets the input of a very broad range of civil society groups. Just setting up an institution takes time, and the board has to walk before it can run. And I'm fully on board with that. But again, I think people who criticize Facebook or have other things to say about it is perfectly welcome, as far as I'm concerned.
So we have a question from our audience, and the person is asking about what are some research topics in this field that are unexplored that you think people need to focus on? That's a big question, but are there top of mind issues that you think we need to address in the coming years?
Well, when it comes to platform governance, I think I'll say a couple of things, and I don't think there are areas that I can think of that no one's working on, but I think there are issues that are not fully fleshed out. One of them is what I've been talking about, which is how do we think about legal norms in the context, the governing legal norms around free expression in particular, in the context of scaled up content moderation, which I think that people have not sufficiently focused on the distinctive problems that arise when we're talking about making decisions about this volume of content, and also making decisions about content that can affect the world to the degree and at the pace that at internet speed. And I think those norms, we try to rely on international human rights law, and that's partly a response to your earlier question as well about are there global norms here? Yes, there are some global norms here, but they're stated at a very high level of generality, and applying them to this kind of novel problem, and I do think it's a novel problem, is very challenging. And I think people have thought a lot about the sort of public-private distinctions, but I think haven't thought as much as they might about how existing legal norms might apply to governance at scale. Right. So that's one issue. I think there are some questions around that I think we're still, as we run around in circles on this, how to think about misinformation, which I think is a very, very tricky problem. And damaging misinformation is the sort of thing where you know it when you see it. But I think that we maybe are not. It's easy to see the extremes and to see where the extreme problems come in. It's harder to think about how to construct a regime that actually polices misinformation that we would be comfortable with, insofar as misinformation is, it doesn't take that much thought to recognize that misinformation is a pervasive part of our society, even in ways that we tend to think of as fairly benign. People misrepresent things all the time. I used to be a fact checker professionally, and virtually everything you read in a typical news story, certainly today at the pace at which news stories are published, is wrong in some way or other, often in small ways. Having an overseer of that is a very, very fraught enterprise. And we would not want that overseer to be Facebook. But it's hard to know who we would not want it to be, whoever the current administration is. Who would we want it to be is hard. And would we want it to be anyone? Should we be focused instead on harm? So I think there's a lot of sort of anger about the way in which platforms can spread harmful misinformation. I think there's still just a lot of work to be done on how to design structures that can be trusted to police misinformation.
So, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, for example, about COVID misinformation and disinformation. And it appeared, there was a story on NPR. I don't know who fact checked it, but there was a story in NPR that the disinformation around COVID could be originated in like less than a dozen, less than 10 people who had kind of initially developed content that then was virally transmitted by lots of people. So I'm wondering, as we kind of grapple with these very thorny, big problems, are there ways to start with, kind of tackling those things at the source, or does that really become as challenging to do as, other individual users who are amplifying the posts? Like, is it possible to tackle these issues at the source?
So yes, I think if the only problem that one is concerned with is the problem of the spread of misinformation on social media platforms, then you could resolve that problem by just having a lot of false positives. You could just say, like, anything that sort of touches on misinformation. You could have very broad rules. And then the objection would be that there would be a lot of things that would just not be on the platform that are true, or that are helpful. In this context, for example, right, the WHO and the CDC have said a number of things. Dr. Anthony Fauci said a number of things over the course of the pandemic that later turned out to be untrue, right? Involving masks, for example, and what their efficacy was. So was Anthony Fauci, the big, one of the dirty dozen or whatever as of March of 2020? I mean, all of which is to say that it's a very complicated problem. The people who traffic in misinformation are also very sophisticated actors, right? So the second you put in place some rule, they will work around that rule. If you say, some people have been saying this, I wonder if that's true, right? Am I spreading misinformation? Well, you could construct an algorithm or train a human reviewer to take that down, but doing that at scale is really hard. Are you going to stifle all conversation, and you're going to get lots of false positives, right? So I'm not suggesting that it's impossible, or that one should not try to get much better at this. Just that it's harder than it seems, and I think sort of trying to craft solutions to this problem that fully recognize the difficulty of the issue. And I think there, stuff in Congress just doesn't get there. Is I'd like to still to see more of that than I've seen.
So should our focus then be more on sort of civic education and sort of building shared values and norms, and thinking about how we treat each other, whether offline or online? Because as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about the fact that there are human beings underlying the spread of misinformation and disinformation. There are human beings who are, at the root of many of the technological actions that we are talking about. So, how do we focus on institutional trust and shared values?
Well, I feel like this is a question that is fits very much within the Carr Center and its focus, but feels above my pay grade on how to educate ourselves, how to trust each other, and how to do so appropriately. I tend to think, and I can't be especially concrete about this, and this is something that people have worked on, but I think not yet successfully. But I think much more. So one thing I'll mention is what I mentioned earlier, and what Ethan Zuckerman mentioned, is a digital public infrastructure, which is and people I think talked about this in the media space in general. So that the idea that that state-run media has a bad name in the U.S. for sure, but not just in the U.S. as propaganda, right? But state-run media, or some version of it, is also NPR, and it's also the BBC, and having genuine public investment in research institutions, in think tanks, in a digital infrastructure, right? So, is there a public option for social media where, if you would like to connect with your friends, but don't want it to be driven by an advertising model, should there be a public option for that that then competes with private companies, and then maybe leads the private companies to make choices that, there are design questions. There are questions of exactly what content moderation would look like in that kind of space, which is part of what my impetus is in trying to say we need to start thinking about this, because if we are to build those institutions of trust, if we are to actually put material resources into trying to create spaces in which we have informed conversation, in which we begin to trust education, trust knowledge in ways that have fallen by the wayside, that we need to start thinking about what the legal rules and legal norms around that kind of space will look like now. And it shouldn't look like the legacy First Amendment, which is, there's a big difference between saying, I'm going to stop the neo-Nazis from marching in front of City Hall, and our First Amendment tradition says don't do that. Don't stop them. There's a big difference between that and saying I'm going to give them a platform that amplifies their speech to anyone who's interested. Our First Amendment doesn't have any way of distinguishing between those two things, but it needs to have a way if there's going to be a way forward.
So before we wrap up, I'd like to come back to your initial remarks about rights and justice. And I'd love for you to expand a bit about how you conceptualize the connection between rights and justice, and how you see the path forward around the role of rights in this digital world.
So what I would say at bottom is that we need to understand the relationship between rights and pluralism. And which is to say, so you asked how do rights relate to justice? Well, the way in which they don't relate to justice is the bare fact that someone's right is recognized and overcomes the government interest in a particular conflict over rights does not mean that justice was done in and of itself, right? In order to understand that, we have to understand something about what kind of right is being exercised. What's the nature? How is it being burdened, right? So if I take freedom of speech or freedom of expression, right? Freedom of expression is burdened when I say that my political enemies the government's political enemies should be hanged. Freedom of expression is also burdened if I say that air traffic controllers have to give truthful information to pilots. Those are both burdens on free expression, but the fact that there's a burden doesn't tell us what's just, right? We need to know something about the context. We need to know something about why the government is doing what it's doing. We need to know something about how burdensome what it's doing might be on expressive interests. We need to know what goals are being pursued. Governance, democratic governance, right, is also a value. It's also one of the ways we protect our rights, right? One of the ways, and I think the paradigmatic way in which we protect our rights is by passing laws to protect those rights. Another way we protect rights is by allowing courts to decide individual cases that come into conflict with those laws. But there are rights often on, and again, I think paradigmatically on all sides of a dispute. And so I think we need to develop a better vocabulary for thinking about how to manage the existence of rights across a dispute, the existence of rights in the claims made by individuals, and also the rights that are embedded within within the governance models we create, right? So when we translate that into the digital space, I think it's all the more important, given that the institutional context is so very different from what James Madison was thinking about, that we understand that the question of justice is not just a question of individual rights as against hegemonic institution, right? It's also a question of what are the institution's goals? How do they connect to people's rights? What are they trying to accomplish? What structures do they have in place for preventing abuses or preventing arbitrary decision making? Right. The idea that the government, when it interferes with someone's rights, may yet be doing something good. And at the same time, those rights are important, right? Thinking about all those things simultaneously is a challenge, and that's a challenge. That's a management challenge. It's a challenge it's a challenge of what strategies and resources do we have for thinking about these simultaneously, and I think the problem comes in when we view those kinds of conflicts as something that needs to be litigated or judicialized, that there has to be an authoritative decision maker that decides which rights are more important than others. That's not a very good, effective, I think, strategy for dealing with pluralism. The fact that we're all different from each other, we have different commitments and values, and we have to figure out how to live together.
Thank you so much, Jamal, for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for tuning in as well.
Thank you.